Today, we're going to start chapter 6, which is the need to justify our actions. And this is a really interesting chapter, and it can be really good to make us think about why people act the way that they do given certain situations. And it's really helpful for us to understand why people do things that are dangerous for themselves, dangerous to others, why people engage in what we would consider like crazy or outlandish behaviors, and behaviors that are kind of against what we would think would be along the lines of their attitudes or beliefs. And so this is a really nice chapter to think about how this can apply to what we see in the world today, and also looking at kind of past behaviors. When we're looking at examples of these kinds of things, like people behaving in such a way that doesn't make sense or that seems to kind of go against what we would expect. So the Heaven's Gate cult is a really good example to use in this case because, first of all, cult behavior is often an interest to people because they're just intrigued by it. But also a lot of people don't understand and they're not educated on how people act. And so if you guys remember back at the beginning of the semester, one of the questions I asked you before you learn anything about social psychology is that how do you explain people who join cults? Like, are they crazy? Are they all the same? Do they have the same needs? Are they vulnerable? Are they gullible? What is it? And some of you put, well, I think that everybody who joins a cult is gullible, or they're all, they might have different needs, or they might be different people, but they're all kind of the same sort of vulnerable needs to join a group support type people. And what we find is that that's not always the case, because anybody, for really any reason, can decide to join a cult. Sometimes they're born into them and they don't know any different. And sometimes they're in a place where they want to be a part of something bigger. Not all the time do we see people who are vulnerable or who need support systems joining cults. So it's a pretty complex behavior, and it's a complex situation. And remember that part of social psychology is always understanding the social context, trying to understand the constructs that are involved in why people decide to do the things that they do. So a really interesting example of this is the Heaven's Gate cult. Now, I know that there are documentaries on this, there's news articles on this, there's YouTube videos on this. So if this is something that you're like, well, that's interesting, I would like to know more information, there are a lot of things out there about it because it's heavily studied, because it was such an interesting thing that happened. So essentially what happened was that there was a cult that was referred to as the Heaven's Gate cult. And on March 26, 1997, 39 members of the cult were found in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They were found dead at their compound, okay? And it was essentially a mass suicide. And so the cult members died willingly, they died peacefully, and it was, to them, not considered suicide, okay? So it wasn't like there are other examples of cults that have had what we refer to as mass suicide, which are actually, there's evidence to say that not everybody willingly did it. And so this is why this Heaven's Gate cult example is so good, is because in outward appearances, it does appear that everybody did this willingly. Now, what the cult members believed was that at the time, it was a really kind of cool event happening, which was the Hale-Bopp comet. And it's something that doesn't occur very often. And it was going to be this comet was going to be coming so close to Earth that people in, having like a regular telescope could actually see this comet passing the Earth. And so it was really exciting. And, if you were in school during this time, I know all of you are probably too young for this, but it was a big deal. And people made a big deal about it and said, oh man, during these nights, you can see the comet and it's really, really cool. So we knew this comet was coming around this time. And what the cult members believed was that there would be a spaceship traveling behind the comet, and that was going to be their ticket to a new life in paradise. And so what happened was they decided to purchase a telescope, okay, and look for the spaceship that should be trailing behind this Hale-Bopp comet. And they got the telescope, and it wasn't like a cheap little kid's telescope. It was an expensive, nice telescope. And they looked through the telescope, and they did not see the spaceship, okay? So what they decided was that this telescope was flawed. It was broken, okay? And it just so happened that there must have been something wrong with the telescope, or they weren't looking at the right area, and they simply discarded that thought of there isn't a spaceship, and just decided that they needed to leave their bodies, which is essentially what they considered a current container, and continue with the plan to escape Earth anyway. And so even though their whole plan was to leave their bodies and to, I guess, get on the spaceship, they decided to continue with their plan. And even though they had zero evidence to suggest that this thing was actually there and it was going to happen. So what they had to do was they had to make this justification to themselves that they were in fact going to go through with this action, even though they had no evidence, and even though they had no other kind of right to believe that this was going to happen and this was going to be true, that suddenly this spaceship is going to turn up. And so this is a really extreme example of the need to justify our actions. Now, these people who were part of this cult were not crazy. They weren't like unhinged. They had this compound in California, and the neighbors described them as very pleasant. They weren't irrational. They weren't stupid. They didn't act crazy. They seemed very pleasant, smart, and reasonable people. And so how can we explain such an extreme behavior, right, when there's no evidence to support them engaging in this behavior, okay? And so what we do is we explain this in the sense of justifying our actions, right? So one thing that we do as humans is we really, really try to maintain a favorable view of ourselves, okay? Especially when we find evidence that contradicts something that might go against our self-image, we try very, very hard to maintain a very stable and positive self-image. Now, sometimes we're hard on ourselves, and sometimes, we're our own worst critic. But generally speaking, we really do want to believe that we are reasonable and decent people. And we want to think that we make good decisions and wise decisions, that we don't behave immorally, and that generally speaking, we have integrity. And so we don't want to believe that we're stupid, that we're cruel, or that we do absurd things, right? We want to have this sort of favorable view of ourselves. And whenever we're confronted with information that would imply that we might have behaved like immorally or irrationally or stupid, it makes us uncomfortable, right? So have you ever been in a situation when you are like lying in bed and it's like 2 a.m. and then you think back to like 3rd grade when you said something really stupid, or you said something, or somebody said something about you that was like, oh, that person is unhinged, or 3rd graders don't say that, but like somebody said that you acted stupidly, or you made a wrong move or something. How do you feel when you think back and that whole memory hits you? And maybe you hadn't thought about that thing in like 2 years or 10 years. And then suddenly you get hit with this 3rd grade memory of you doing something stupid. How do you feel? Angry, upset, uncomfortable. You don't like it, right? You don't like to dwell on it, okay? if you get called stupid or if you get called irrational, you don't want to feel this about yourself. And so you don't like that discomfort. So what we do is we try really hard to make sure that we have a positive self-image of ourselves. And like I said, occasionally we have these thoughts, but they make us uncomfortable. So sometimes we do things like try to push them out of our mind or try to make up for it somewhere else by doing a good behavior, right? Because what that does is it reinforces the fact, no, I am a good person, right? So if you're lying in bed at 2 a.m. and you think of something that you did, maybe you did something mean, or maybe you did something irrational and somebody called you out on it. What are some thoughts that you can do that helps to relieve the discomfort other than just trying to push it out of your mind? Okay, so looking back at the situation and saying, what did I know? How did I act given the context of the situation? And would I act that way now had I known all of that, right? Yeah, and you go through the process of sort of forgiving yourself. Another thing that we can do is just remind ourselves of times that we did good things, right? And just try to tell ourselves, oh, here's something on chat. Tell yourself you aren't that person anymore, that you've grown. Absolutely. And that's a way for us to be able to forgive ourselves for things that we've done and try to justify our behaviors, right? So when we look at the context and say, well, I did that because of these reasons, that's justifying that particular behavior. And we're going to get into what happens when we try to change our thoughts, what happens when we try to change our behaviors. All of these things are things that we can do to make ourselves feel better, okay? So we're going to go all through that in just a second here. So let's stop for a second and talk about cognitive dissonance. So these are the terms that I want us to really know and walk away from, okay? Because I'm going to be using these kind of throughout. And so you really need to make sure that you kind of write down what I mean by these things, because I use some of these interchangeably. So essentially what this is this comes from Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance that he thought of back in 1957, okay? And so two thoughts that are consistent with one another are ones that we call consonant. So for example, let's say you think you like Michael Jordan, the basketball player, okay? And you think that he is the best basketball player ever in existence, okay? Those two things line up to each other. Not only do you like Michael Jordan, but you also think that he's the greatest basketball player. Those are consonant or consistent with each other. Thoughts that might be inconsistent are ones that we refer to as dissonant, okay? So consonant, consistent, dissonant, different, okay? So for example, you might say, I believe that cigarettes are harmful and can kill you, but you smoke cigarettes. So these are two things that conflict with one another. They're conflicting thoughts, a behavior conflicting with a cognition, okay? So two thoughts that are inconsistent or dissonant. And so I use inconsistent, different, dissonant sort of interchangeably. Consonant and consistent, I use sort of interchangeably because they mean the same thing, okay? When you have thoughts that run inconsistent with one another or dissonant with one another, that is something that is going to cause you discomfort, okay? And this is where that cognitive dissonance comes in. So when you have something especially that runs counter to a good self-image of yourself, okay, then that is going to cause you discomfort and it's going to cause you cognitive dissonance, okay? And the reason why this is so uncomfortable is because it's a threat to our self-image. Now, remember that we want to keep a very positive view of ourselves, right? And those that have threats to our self-image tend to be more powerful and more severe than other dissonant thoughts, okay? So not all inconsistent or dissonant thoughts are created equally. And we'll talk about some examples here in a minute. Now, Festinger's theory, which is a very prominent theory, is one that we talk about in terms of how people justify their actions, how they change their behaviors, how they change their attitudes, how they continue to have something that goes counter to an original thought, okay? And at first, a lot of psychologists really thought that dissonant thoughts were all sort of the same. And they said, okay, well, if you're uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. And as we started to study this more, we realized that they really aren't created equal, and that some of these dissonant thoughts are much more powerful than others and cause a greater chance of either behavioral change or attitude change. Okay. And we're going to talk about the effects of that in a minute. One thing that I'd like us to think about, okay, is the dissonant thought of smoking cigarettes can kill me, but I smoke cigarettes. So what are some justifications that you hear a smoker say out loud or think to justify the action of smoking, even though it counters the thought that smoking is dangerous? So what are some justifications that you might have heard somebody say that is the reason why they smoke, or that's the reason why they continue this behavior, even though they consider it potentially dangerous? Okay, so I can quit anytime. I choose to do this. I know it's dangerous, but I continue because I can quit at any point. Okay, we got something in chat. They have the mindset that something is going to kill them anyway, so they keep doing it. And that's a huge one, right? Well, you got to die somehow, right? Okay, that's my husband's excuse for eating junk food. You got to die of something, right? So might as well be like, high cholesterol. So that's a justification. Absolutely. Got to die of something. It might as well be that. Ooh, it relieves stress. Well, okay, I can stop smoking, but then I'll be super stressed out, and that's what's going to kill me, right? Absolutely. That's a big one, right? What else? So along the same lines of it relieves stress. Well, when I smoke, I don't gain weight, right? And so they might say, well, it makes me, thinner if I smoke, and if I stop smoking, I'll gain weight. Okay, so somebody say they could be doing something worse. Well, I could be addicted to, meth. I could be smoking meth, but no, I'm smoking cigarettes. Absolutely. Justifying it by saying they could be doing something worse. Some people say, well, my friends do it. And then another thing that you can do is downplay the bad effects of smoking. So some people might say, well, do we really know it's that dangerous? And the filters, I smoke filtered cigarettes, so therefore the filter catches all the bad stuff. My grandmother smoked all her life and she was fine, So there's definitely a lot of ways that we can justify a potentially dangerous behavior that goes against our beliefs. Once we have a conflicting set of beliefs and thoughts, there's three ways that we can make ourselves feel better. There's three ways that we can reduce that discomfort and dissonance, okay? We can change our behavior. So in the case of smoking, you think, wow, it really can kill you. I'm going to stop smoking, or I'm going to reduce my smoking, right? You can justify the behavior by changing a dissonant cognition, okay? And so you can decide, for example, that, I think that it's really not that dangerous, and there's other things that I could do that could be worse, okay? Or you can justify the behavior by adding new cognitions, okay? By saying things like, well, I know a lot of people who smoke a long time, and they don't seem quite as, they never got lung cancer, or they never, got sick, okay? Or, by saying, hey, there's a new research study out that says that it really isn't as dangerous. So you can add new thoughts, you can change existing thoughts, okay? You can change your behavior. Let's look at bullying as an example, okay? This is a good one because a lot of times people have some experience with bullying, whether on the receiving end or the giving end, okay? And so this can be as minor as, seeing somebody kind of getting teased versus beat up versus like severe trauma in terms of psychological trauma. There's a whole range that we could look at here, right? But let's look at generally bullying in general. Have you ever engaged in bullying or not stopped it? So witnessed it happen and not do anything about it, or actually engage in some level of bullying yourself. So maybe your friends were doing it and then you just kind of added in, or just chose not to stop it for any reason. So let's just pretend that everybody has at some point engaged in this behavior. Let me ask you this. Did it make you feel good? What kinds of things then would you say or think to yourself to justify that bullying behavior that you did, or the fact that you did not stop someone else from getting bullied? Okay, so they deserved it. Yep, I got it on chat. They deserve it. Let's think back to the terms that you guys have been learning in this class. To say that that person deserved it would be to blame their behavior, their bullying behavior, or their, if you're bullying the bully, or whatever trait that you say they deserve it for. Either they're being stupid, or they're being mean, or they're asking for it, okay? What are we engaging in when we blame their behavior on an internal trait and not the context? Fundamental attribution error, to say something like that person deserves it, or they're a jerk and therefore they deserve this bullying or teasing. Now, what could be the case? Like, why could this person be acting out? Let's ignore the fact that they really are a jerk. Maybe they're not. What could be, the reason why they smell, or the reason why they are dressed dirty, or the reason why they're acting out, or the reason why they're acting, stupid in class? Like, what are some reasons that are externally explained? Maybe they're being abused or neglected at home. Okay. Maybe they have a mental disability. Absolutely. There are things that could explain why the person's acting the way that they are, or why they engage in that particular kinds of behavior. So it could be completely 100% externally explained because of the context. Maybe they're undergoing stress. Maybe there's something going on at home. Maybe they're dealing with a death in the family. Maybe they're dealing with a loss of someone or something close to them, and that could be changing why they are behaving the way that they are. And so we make this fundamental attribution error because it's easy to do. It's easy to say, oh, you're just crazy, or you're just, mean, you're just a jerk, so therefore you deserve that, because it's a justification. We can now treat you like shit because we think less of you. And that's exactly how we see in cases like war, in torture. We justify our actions because we think that that person is less than. So therefore we go, oh, okay, well, we can be mean to them because they're dumb or they're less than me, right? So we can make that fundamental attribution error, which makes it a lot easier to justify our actions against them, okay? What are some other things that we do to justify not helping somebody who's being bullied, or we are bullying them themselves? Okay, hold on, I got another chat here. Okay, when we see somebody being bullied, being afraid that being bullied yourself or harmed, absolutely, that's a huge one, right? You're scared that if you say something, then the bullying will turn to you. So you justify the reason why you don't engage because you're worried, right? That is going to be then turned in on you. So that's definitely something that can justify your own behavior and say, okay, well, if I say something, I'm going to get bullied, right? What else? Now, there's definitely cases where you might engage in bullying. Like, for example, if you were worried that bullying was going to turn it on you, and so you engaged in it, even if you wasn't like really, a large engagement in it, okay, that would be conformity, because you conformed to the group you allowed it to happen or contributed to it because of your fear that it was going to be placed on yourself. Another thing that you can do is just say, well, you know what, that happened, but I'm a good person, right? I volunteer, I help people in other areas. Yeah, I contributed to the bullying, but I know that I'm a good person. And what that is a self-affirmation. You're telling yourself, I'm a good person. You know, this is not a representative of who I am as a person. And so you can reduce your dissonant feelings by saying to yourself, well, this is not representative of me, and I'm a good person because of these other reasons, right? Now, another thing that you can do is change your cognition completely about bullying. And so when you say something like, well, I mean, bullying's harmless, or how they were bullied is harmless. It's not like anybody punched them in the face, right? They just teased them a little, right? That's not a big deal. And that is a complete change in a view of bullying. So if you have an example where you teased somebody and somebody calls you out and says, why are you bullying them? You might be like, I mean, it wasn't bullying. I was just teasing them. It was harmless. What you're doing is you are changing your cognition, your attitude towards bullying. So is this going to make you more or less likely to bully in the future? More likely, because now your behaviors and your thoughts are going to line up again. And what's going to be your justification next time? You're just teasing. It's not a big deal, right? Sure, you can completely change your definition of bullying. You can say, well, I don't consider this bullying. This isn't really bullying. It's just teasing. So this umbrella term that we use for bullying, which includes, very minor teasing to all the way to almost killing somebody or having them hurt themselves, that's a very big range, right? But it encompasses everything, direct, indirect, all of it. And for you to change how you view bullying, okay, it's the same thing as smoking versus vaping. Well, vaping isn't smoking, right? Okay, you're changing your operational definition of what that thing is and saying, well, I'm not including it in that. Okay, I don't care that in the field they consider anything that's teasing to be under bullying. You're not going to justify that in your head. It's an irrational thought. Okay, and that's another thing that's really important, is this idea of rationalizing and rational thought. These are two very different things. Rationalizing it is the same thing as justifying it, right? If I'm justifying a behavior, I'm trying to make myself feel better about it. Does justification, does that usually line in with rational thought? Usually not, right? Okay. So there's a schematic here that just goes over exactly what we talked about in terms of the three kinds of things that you can do when there is dissonant thoughts and behaviors. So here we can see this person right here. You're a happy, reasonably happy, content person. You have a decent amount of self-esteem. And we're going to talk about how self-esteem kind of comes into this, right? And then you have here, okay, you're smoking, and then there's a sign that says the Surgeon General has determined that smoking is hazardous to your health. And so you engage in smoking, which goes against your self-image of yourself. And in this case, it's something that might be stupid or foolish, or in other cases, immoral. And so now you're experiencing dissonance. And now is the thought, the action of smoking, and then the Surgeon General warning, the knowledge that smoking is bad. These things are inconsistent or dissonant, right? So now what do? Okay. How do you reduce that unpleasant arousal state? Okay. What motivates you to do that? So you could change your behavior. This is the hardest one. This is the one that you see the least likely. Okay. Nobody's smoking and then sees a study about smoking and they're like, you know what? I'm tossing these cigarettes. Now, it does happen. It absolutely happens. Okay. But this is the hardest one to do. This is the hardest thing to do, is engage in behavioral change. It's a lot easier to change your thoughts around things and to convince yourself otherwise. It's really hard to change your habits, really hard. Okay. So this one right here is the easiest in theory, right? Just change your behavior, just stop doing that thing. Okay. But we're creatures of habit and we don't like doing that, right? Here, you could change your cognitions. So you could say, you know what? I mean, is it really that bad? You know what I'm saying? Like, is it really something that's gonna kill me? I mean, it could be that the research is kind of inconclusive. Okay. Now, or you could add consonant cognition. So remember, consonant means consistent. So you can add consistent thoughts to your behaviors. Well, when I smoke, I'm relaxed. Okay. My grandfather is 87 years old and he's been smoking a pack a day since he was 12 and he's fine. Okay. That's proof to me that cigarettes aren't really that bad. Okay. You could add the cognition that it's enjoyable. Okay. And remember, that's consistent with the thought of smoking. It's consistent with the behavior. It's enjoyable. You can say to yourself, well, this is something that I do to calm myself down and to make sure I don't, gain weight. Okay. So these are adding consistent thoughts. Okay. Now what you're going to do is then, in essence, if you do 5, 6, or 7, whether you change your thoughts, add thoughts, or change your behavior, that is going to lead you to reducing your cognitive dissonance. If you do either of those things successfully, changing your behaviors, changing your thoughts, or adding thoughts, okay, then you're going to reduce the dissonance and you're going to feel good about yourself. Okay. And this also, involved in this are things like self-affirmations. Okay. And saying, you know what, I'm good at these things, or I'm a good person, or I eat healthy and I exercise. Therefore, smoking's not that bad because, I'm really good at these other things. Okay. So that self-affirmation can also make yourself feel better because it's a bump in self-esteem. Because remember, the reason why they're so dissonant is because it takes a hit on your self-esteem and your self-image. Okay. You don't want to be inconsistent with your self-image. So change a behavior, changing in a thought. Oh, do they really know? I mean, I thought that smoking was bad for you, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, is it? Or adding cognitions to this situation that are consistent with your behavior. Those 3 things will engage in you feeling a whole lot better if you can do them successfully.